Okay, so I'm having a conversation with Michelle. She led on the creation of our retention manager. The application is, I want to really understand the application, and we understand that the application has some limitations due to NetSuite's API for scalability. However, the framework for which we've created is powerful for what we're trying to achieve. And so I wanted to try and understand that. And then we can talk about the enhancements. Effectively, we're trying to obfuscate data, which means all that personal identifiable information that's in a database, right, Michelle?
Correct, and purge, yeah.
And purge, meaning also, if we can, remove records.
It can be any record that's defined and accessible via the API.
Got it, okay. And thus the idea then would be we could remove data, which would trim the database and also help us with our privacy concerns, and obfuscate. That's the two primary things we're trying to achieve.
Correct, on a schedule repeatedly.
On a schedule repeatedly, right? And what we did is you helped create a mechanism of defining the parameters and or policies of how to look at the database so that these algorithms can do their things behind the scenes. Is that what we did?
Correct, yep. So let's take a look at the Prolecto Data Retention Manager. And I have an example policy set up that we can look at. This has already been running in the background, so it has some history to it. Okay. So right now, they're all disabled, so that's why we're seeing this error message up there. Just to let you know that nothing's going to happen while we're looking at it right now.
Okay, good.
So this is a policy. On the policy, you'll set a schedule. So how frequently will this batch of things happen?
Okay, so the idea is a policy can represent a batch of actions, and it's designed to be scheduled.
Yep, and you can assign an owner to that so that that person can get notifications about what's happened with this policy. Each of these lines down here are an action. So on the action, we'll find what records are going to be included and then what's going to happen to them. We can look at log files. So you have two ways that you can, well, technically on files, you can do three different ways of selecting the files. You can do a saved search.
Okay.
You can do a QL query that's stored right here. Or you can use the simple selector, which lets you set a folder and a file type, and then a number of days since either created or modified for those files. So to wait 19 days and then delete them.
Wow. Okay, this is really cool because we've seen situations just where we want to clean up stuff. So at a very simple level, you just showed a way of just pointing to a file cabinet or pointing to logs or various things that we know. You're saying it's as simple as just creating these pointers and setting a schedule.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, that totally makes sense.
You do want to be careful that you're sizing it. You test it a little first, because you could say, delete 300,000 of something in one pass, and it's probably going to get a little jammed up, but
okay,
you can do it.
You can do it. Okay, so you be a little careful when you dial it in.
Correct. And we can see the history on that. So the first time we ran it, had 9 files and it processed them. It had no failures. If you click in to view this record, then this log shows for each record ID that was processed that it was deleted. And if there were any issues, then it would return that here as a message, so you can follow up with that individual record. Okay,
wait. So if I understand, this is pretty powerful. It actually identified the records. It's giving me the ID of the record. And it looks like a little bit of a file type. Type was file, okay, versus record. But of course, we can't see the data, but we can. But at least we had the old ID, because the record, the thing's gone.
Correct. Yep. You can see that I left the schedule running, but there's no results. So it's just logging each time it ran. It's logging that it had no results to process. But if you were to continue writing these log files over, through the next week, then it would just pick them up and take care of them.
Oh, that makes sense.
So let's go back to our policy. And this one is log records. So these aren't files, these are records that another one of our processes is writing. And I've created a saved search here instead of the file cabinet settings, which is empty, but I can show you kind of the criteria we're using here.
Okay.
So I've set a hard date and I've set a max number of rows to include. So this is good for testing.
Yeah,
You're going to be very specific about the data, and then you can open that up as you're ready to go live with it. And the results really don't matter that you return. It's always going to use the internal ID of the record that is of this search as well. If you need to do something more complicated, like query customers and then delete their contact records, then you'd want to use a query instead, a SuiteQL query, which you can write here, and you'll return the ID and the record type as fields in that query. So, and we have some examples of that in our user guide, which is included with the system. So here's one where we're going to obfuscate. So this is where we're going to just choose fields that are going to get overwritten with a value. Okay, but we're selecting those records here with a query, very specific again, and we can indicate which fields. So let me go ahead and load this. It might take a little while if there's a lot of records or fields on that record.
Well, it actually is reading in the records and it's getting the field database.
Correct, yes. Not every field is available. This is only giving the ones that are available for us to process via the NetSuite PI removal tool. So currently we use that as the processor for this because it allows us to also clear out system notes. So the system note history as well as the workflow log history that we don't have the ability to directly access.
The name of that tool?
PI removal, person identifying information.
And this is where we've discovered that their tool, it runs slow.
It's very slow. Some fields, like we can mark address here, but sometimes it does not actually work on the address. It doesn't support sublists. So there are limitations, and we may expand on that going forward if there's a need or a request for it.
The field list that you're getting here is it, you said not everyone is there.
We are able to actually make the same call that their system does to get the list of fields.
Let me stop for a second here now. NetSuite's offering this PI removal tool. Why doesn't NetSuite have this, what we're doing here, this nice front end?
They have a front end, but it's really designed to, you want to click on one person's name or one transaction or one email address. It lists every record, and you have to manually select each record you want to process. So that, yeah, not very capable. And it appears to run as a mass update, but we can't really tell.
Got it. Because at the end of the day, we probably looked at all that, and when our client said we wanted to implement, they're going, how are we going to implement this? So we needed to get a framework in place to be able to describe all of this. Their tool only does, the PI only does obfuscation. It didn't do all the other stuff. So we said, look, if we're going to have a record retention policy, let's take care of also the removal of other data elements, right? That's how we augmented it, correct?
Correct, yep.
Okay, you know what? This is awesome. This kind of care in the larger databases, in the larger organizations, we're not doing data archiving. We're not pulling out the data. We are actually changing the data. So somebody, if they wanted to archive it, they got to get it out first, put it someplace. Then they could run this tool to get rid of it. Is that fair?
That's correct.
And so here, when you look at the execution history, does it sort of describe the same thing? It just says what are the target records and what the action was? Correct.
Now, these ones are a bit more detailed. They give status as it processes. So essentially when it started and it was processing, and per field, occasionally it will return a false positive or a false negative, and that's another issue that we found that we have to look into. The field won't be able to save, but it will still mark the whole thing as successful. And so these records still exist, and they write to certain values that are predefined by NetSuite. So it'll be like PI removed at example.com for the email address. And I've documented what those are. So
is it possible to look at this record right now? I guess it's record 2186 and just see what it touched. Is there something visible I can see?
Sure. Okay, so here's an example. The fields that we selected, it's essentially taking the name, since this is a named individual, not a company. It's doing the first name and last name, to the email, to the phone number. Address, it didn't have any addresses, but on transactions, it will handle the address usually, and it will just keep the city, state, and zip information for tax purposes, but it will clear out the rest.